I'm not very good at promoting myself, like getting out there onto platforms and touting the things that I do, or, getting my name out there and all that kind of stuff. In my assessment of this, it's not that I'm afraid of being judged necessarily. That doesn't bother me so much. It doesn't bother me, the idea that people place judgments on me or the things that I say. Everyone places judgments on, well, essentially everything in life. So it's not that. What bothers me is the idea of being misunderstood. I find that if you put out your opinion, I tend to find that I'm being very careful about how I word things, because I don't want it to be misunderstood. Because I don't mind being judged, but I don't want to be judged on incorrect information necessarily. So recently I saw sort of a helpful quote of some sort. And the gist of it was, I think it went, stop worrying about the judgment of people whose opinions you wouldn't ask for. So the general idea being, if you are going through something in life, or you have something that that you need other people's input on, the only people you should be worried about what they think is really the people who you would proactively reach out to for an opinion, as opposed to whatever's out there in the world. I thought this was kind of interesting. I think it was kind of, I guess, empowering is a certain word to it. It rung true to me, this idea that if you're not going to seek out someone's opinion, then it's kind of like, who cares what they think anyway? If they're it's like an unsolicited piece of advice, whether it be positive or negative. I then saw another thing, or actually I was listening to another thing, where the person speaking, their point was, it was kind of that old, what would the younger version of me think? So the idea being, if the younger version of myself saw me now, would they be proud of me or not? Would they be happy with where their life is headed? And I found that these two pieces of I don't know, wisdom, or these two random truisms, I don't know, they blend together interestingly, the more I thought about it. If you're willing to accept that you shouldn't worry about what people think whose opinions you wouldn't seek out, but then on the other hand, you have this idea of, what would the younger version, like let's just say the 18-year-old version of me, what would they think? It raises the question, is the 18-year-old version of myself, and I'm just picking on 18 because I think that's what the person was saying, is the 18-year-old version of myself someone whose opinion I would seek out? Like, if I had a challenging problem, or just wanted input on something important, is the 18-year-old version of myself someone I would ask that of? Would I seek that version of myself's input? I think this has a few facets to it. First of all, I think we have that thought of, what would the younger version of myself think, or would the younger version of myself be proud of me, or whatever? Because the younger version of yourself, at least if you're comparing, an 18-year-old version of yourself versus, say, a 30 or 40-year-old version of yourself, most likely the 18-year-old version of yourself was a more idealized version, or had a more idealized perspective on the future of where things would go. You might at that time in your life be thinking, I'm going to accomplish X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to, whatever your kind of life goals are. I'm going to have a family, and I'm going to, make $1 million, or like whatever your goals are. I'm not saying that those were my goals, but whatever your goals are. And then, but part of life is sort of rolling with it as it comes at you. Because you don't necessarily always get to decide the exact course. And hopefully, if you've done things well, you have maybe achieved more of your goals than not, or you've at least achieved some of them. But you've probably also done things that you're not proud of. You've probably made choices that maybe you wonder what the other choice might have been like. Maybe you've made choices that are in direct conflict, even if you don't look at them and say, oh, I wonder what path B would have been like. Maybe you still have made choices, though, that are in direct conflict with whatever that 18-year-old idealized version of yourself, or the 18-year-old version of yourself who believes in sort of the ideal outcome of the rest of things. Maybe it was in direct conflict with what that person would have thought. But maybe it's a choice that these days you're proud of, and you look back on and think, well, with my experience, I know that this was the right choice. That version of myself couldn't have possibly known that. There are many psychological phenomenons and research tied to these concepts. And there's some interesting stuff. Some of this comes down to things like the discrepancy between your actual self and your idealized self. Some of it comes down to themes of nostalgia and how looking back always feels often, well, I shouldn't say always, but often feels like sort of rose-colored glasses, simpler time, all that kind of stuff. So you think back to, oh, who was I as an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 14-year-old or whatever time period you're thinking about with this. And you think, oh, that person was so much more innocent, and their goals and dreams. Implicitly inside of all this is this idea that somehow their goals were more important than yours now. And I think that's the crux of why I find this interesting. Because you really got to ask, would you seek out that person's opinions? You have 10, 20, however many, 30 years of living and experience piled on top of what that person knew. So can their viewpoints still be of any value? Were their goals inherently misaligned with where you ended up just because they couldn't possibly have known? If so, why is looking back at that person, why judge yourself against that at all? Why even think of these thoughts? But I think many people do. Oh, the younger me had different goals, I ended up over here. Or, and then there's a flip side of the coin, of course, I'm sure there are plenty of people, I'm not one of them, but there are plenty of people, I'm sure, who had a set of goals at 18, and they carried them through. They had 5 goals and they hit all 5, and now they're there. Have those people found that was a good path to take? I personally know, I can think off the top of my head of at least 2 people who followed that sort of path, who had a series of goals at 18. They knocked through every one of them, got to the end of that line, and then looked around and said, this wasn't really what I thought it was going to be. Because in some ways, they were following, for 10, 15 years, the advice of an 18-year-old. And is that a person you should be judging yourself by? I have no conclusion here, really. I just think it's an interesting thought experiment. The idea of layering, if you wouldn't care about the opinion of a random teenager, is that any less or more valuable than the random opinion of yourself at that same age? And why do we put so much more weight on one compared to the other? Let alone if you don't care about the opinion or the input of some random person with much more life experience. You know, a 40, 50, 60-year-old who has lived. And if you don't care about their opinion, shouldn't that almost inherently mean that the opinion of yourself 30 years prior really doesn't hold much weight? I'd be curious to hear about anyone's thoughts on this. I just thought it was kind of an interesting dichotomy of ideas. One that, you know, really kind of conflicts. They conflict with one another, at least in my head. Where on the one hand, I definitely wouldn't care all that much about some random person's opinion, or at least I know I shouldn't, compared to, you know, looking back on some of my goals from when I was much younger and wondering if I went down the right path. I'd love to hear your opinions on this, or if you have any expanded thought on the topic.